Literacy tests were the second means that Democrats used to disenfranchise blacks. Literacy tests required a voter to demonstrate a certain level of specific knowledge before he could vote. In some cases, the test was 20 pages long for blacks, and those administering the test were white Democrats who nearly always ruled that blacks were illiterate. Grandfather clauses were the third device used to disenfranchise black Americans, allowing only those individuals to vote whose father or grandfather had been registered to vote prior to the passage of the 15th Amendment. This law ensured that poor and illiterate whites could vote, but not blacks. The fourth device was suppressive election procedures. This included the use of multiple ballots. That is, a Republican voter might be required to cast a ballot in up to 8 separate locations, or sometimes to vote for each individual Republican on a ballot at a separate location before the ballot would be counted. Democratic officials often failed to inform black voters of this complicated procedure, and their ballots were therefore disqualified. Democrats also used what were called hide-and-seek polling places, moving voting boxes to unknown locations at the last minute and then posting armed guards in case any black should stumble upon the voting box. The fifth device included the use of so-called black codes, later called Jim Crow laws, to restrict the freedoms and economic opportunities of blacks. Representative Robert Brown Elliott reported,
"Among the first acts of legislation adopted by the Southern Democratic states were laws which imposed upon the colored race oppressive disabilities and burdens and curtailed their rights in the pursuit of life, liberty, and property to such an extent that their freedom was of little value. Colored citizens were in some states forbidden to even appear in town. They were required to reside on and cultivate the soil without the right to purchase or own it. They were excluded from many occupations, and they were not permitted to testify in any court where a white man was a party."
National observers at that time concluded that the Democratic South was simply trying to institute a new form of slavery through the use of these black codes. Representative Richard Kane of South Carolina agreed.
When the government of the United States had made the black man free, when Congress, in the greatness of its majesty, prepared to give to every class of men their rights, and in reconstructing the southern states, guaranteed to all the people their liberties, Democrats refused to agree to the laws enacted by Congress. You Democrats refused to, and I quote, accept the situation. To recognize the rights of that class of men in this land, you sought to make the Reconstruction Acts a nullity, if possible. You sought to re-enslave the black man by every means in your power.
Southern Democrats went well beyond black codes, however, and also imposed forced segregation. Those Democratic pro-segregation state laws replaced the anti-segregation federal laws passed by Republicans in 1875, and regrettably, those state laws became the legal standard for the next 75 years. The sixth device to disenfranchise black voters was bizarre gerrymandering. Once Democrats regained state legislatures, they began to redraw election lines to make it impossible for Republicans to be elected, thereby preventing blacks from being elected. For example, after Reconstruction, Democrats regained the legislature and began to redraw voting lines so that when the last African American left the Texas State House in 1897, not another one was elected, either as a Republican or a Democrat, for the next 70 years until federal courts struck down the way Texas Democrats drew voting lines. This pattern was typical in other southern states as well. The seventh device used to disenfranchise black voters was that of white-only primaries. When the U.S. Supreme Court finally struck down the state law in 1927, the Democratic Party simply enacted internal Democratic Party policies to prevent blacks from voting in Democratic primaries. In 1935, the Supreme Court upheld this Democratic Party policy of white-only primaries, but in 1944 the court reversed itself and finally struck them down. The eighth device used by Democrats to disenfranchise black Americans was that of physical intimidation and violence. Obviously, the Ku Klux Klan was a leader in this form of violent voter intimidation. As confirmed by Representative James T. Rapier of Alabama,
Democrats were hunting me down like the partridge on the mount, night and day, with their Ku Klux Klan, simply because I was a Republican and refused to bow at the feet of their Baal.
The ninth device used by Democrats to disenfranchise black voters was the revision of state constitutions, to negate many of the rights that had been gained. Other devices employed by Democrats to keep blacks from voting included property ownership requirements. Democrats also used restrictive eligibility requirements, such as residing in a state 2 years before voting, or the paying of excessive annual voter registration fees, fees not struck down by the courts until 1971. Democrats utilized nearly a dozen devices to keep black Americans from voting, something that would have come as no surprise to the earliest African-American civil rights leaders. For example, Representative Joseph Hayne Rainey had earlier declared,
"You cannot expect the Negro to rise while the Democrats are trampling upon him and his rights. We ask you, sir, to do by the Negro as you ought to do by him in justice. If the Democrats are such staunch friends of the Negro, why is it that when new propositions are offered here and elsewhere, looking into the elevation of the colored race and the extension of right and justice to them, why do the Democrats array themselves in unbroken ranks and vote against every such measure?"
The unrelenting Democratic efforts to suppress black voting were successful. For example, in Mississippi in 1892, there were almost 70,000 more blacks than whites in the state. Yet white voters outnumbered black voters by a margin of 8 to 1. And in Birmingham, of the 18,000 blacks who lived in that city at the turn of the century, only 30 were eligible to vote. In Texas, the number of black voters fell from 100,000 to only 5,000. The number of black voters in Alabama and Florida was reduced by nearly 90%. And by the 1940s, only 5% of blacks in the South were registered to vote. In fact, in 1965 in Selma, Alabama, a city with more black residents than white residents, the voting rolls were 99% white and only 1% black. Clearly, Democratic voter suppression efforts had been successful. Returning to the 1800s, recall that Democrats regained partial control of Congress in 1876. That partial control continued for the next 16 years until 1893, when Democrat Grover Cleveland was elected as president, and Democrats gained control of both the House and the Senate. For the first time since Abraham Lincoln, the Democrats had full control of the lawmaking process. Given their new powers, what did Democrats do to assist civil rights? Nothing. Not a single civil rights law was passed by Democrats during that time. In fact, the Democrats immediately passed laws repealing civil rights laws that had not yet been struck down by the Supreme Court. Specifically, Democrats repealed the laws protecting black voting rights as well as those punishing Klan violence. By 1900, Democrats actually began actively to seek the repeal of the 14th and 15th Amendments. In 1901, at the same time that Democrats were seeking to roll back the civil rights amendments to the Constitution, Republican President Teddy Roosevelt raised the ire of many Democrats by inviting Booker T. Washington to the White House. And Washington became the first African American to dine with the president at the White House. While Booker T. Washington's wise counsel was snubbed by Democratic President Woodrow Wilson, it was gladly sought by 3 Republican presidents for whom he served as advisor, including William Taft, William McKinley, and Teddy Roosevelt.